Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us on LinkedIn Live and Twitter for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, Ad Measurement and Revenue Attribution. I'm your host, Eric Hagstrom, eMarketer Senior Forecasting Analyst at Insider Intelligence in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm joined by my colleague, Nicole Perrin, eMarketer Principal Analyst at Insider Intelligence in Chicago. Hi, Nicole. Great to have you here.
Hey, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the main presentation, I'd like to thank Infutor Data Solutions for making today's webinar possible. We'll be hearing later on from Kevin Dean, Chief Operating Officer at Infutor Data Solutions. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for joining us from just outside of Chicago.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Now, a few things before we dive in. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes. We'll email you a link to view the slides and the full recording. But we do want you to participate. Just use the window on the lower right-hand side of your screen to submit any questions at any time during the presentation. We'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A. If your colleagues haven't registered yet but still want to join, no problem. Just share the link that you use to register. So with that, Nicole, let's get started. What's on the agenda for today?
Yeah, well, we're going to be talking today about ad measurement and revenue attribution, and I'll just get right into it because it's one of marketers' most challenging yet also most vital tasks. Here's some research that the IAB and Winterberry Group have been doing annually for a number of years, and every year marketers say that measurement and attribution is going to take up more of their time and attention than anything else. Until last year, when the pandemic actually made enough of a splash that it tied measurement and attribution for importance. And there's a really good reason that this is taking up so much time and attention. It's because marketers want to be successful. They want to gain market share for their products and services. They want to make sure that what they're doing is working and that they're getting a positive return on their advertising investments. And the pressure to do that has really never been greater, largely, again, thanks to the pandemic. The Trade Desk surveyed marketers last September and found that 84% said they were under new pressure to justify spending since the advent of the pandemic. And about 2 in 5 said they were being asked by the C-suite to justify investments that they had never had to justify before. And marketers are doing that by using ad measurement and revenue attribution. And a strong majority are using some type of digital attribution model. More than 8 in 10 are doing something. But that might just include very basic techniques like first or last touch forms of attribution. We estimate that about 2/3 of US companies are using a more sophisticated multi-channel attribution model. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're joining up all channels. It might just mean they're assessing a few in concert, and they potentially really still have a long way to go. What makes it so difficult to get ad measurement and revenue attribution right? There are a bunch of challenges that advertisers have to deal with, including some that have been around for a long time, as well as some that are getting harder even this year. One long-standing barrier here is simply the quality of data. This was the #1 barrier to revenue attribution success in a survey from last fall by Demand Lab and Ascend2. More than 2 in 5 marketers said that they just didn't have good enough data to do an accurate job of attributing revenue to marketing touchpoints. You have to clean data. You have to make sure that it's managed properly. You have to make sure that it's not stuck in silos, that you're bringing together data from many disparate places into one place where you're actually able to glean insights from it and take action from it. And if you start with bad data, you're not going to get good outputs from those inputs. 1 in 3 of the business decision makers who were surveyed last July by Exasol agreed that data quality had to be improved. And that was, again, among the biggest problems with measurement identified in that survey. And I just want to emphasize, this quote from Sean Muller, who is one of the co-founders at iSpot TV, which is a TV ad measurement company. And he really emphasized that you can have a very fancy model, a very nice seeming interface, but if the inputs aren't accurate, the outputs aren't going to be accurate either. and that there's a lot of really difficult activities associated with cleaning data and getting it into a state where you're able to get those insights. Is your data at scale? Is it accurate? Is it modeled up to the US Census level to remove any kind of biases or skews? And by the way, you probably have to do it all in real time if you want it to be useful enough to be able to, for example, optimize a campaign in flight. Another long-standing challenge in ad measurement and revenue attribution is the existence of walled gardens. And, this has been around for a while. It's probably getting more difficult as more and more platforms are keeping the data that they have close to the vest and unwilling to share granular user-level information with their advertising partners. In many cases, advertisers prefer to use their measurement vendor. Not all publishers will allow that. Among those who often get a pass here are the biggest 3 digital ad sellers in the US, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And that means that it is difficult for advertisers to compare the results that they're getting in those channels to what they see across the rest of digital and across the rest of their marketing mix. And when you remember that the triopoly accounts for about 2/3 of digital ad revenues in the US, that's a big chunk of your digital ad measurement that you're not really able to do in concert with the rest, but in more of a siloed environment. And this is also bringing more attention to clean rooms, because that's an important way that advertisers can get some more insights from these platforms. But again, it's then a matter of bringing those insights together with what you might be getting elsewhere, potentially at a more granular level, and figuring out how to do that in a way that makes sense. And generally speaking, transparency is lacking in many ways, whether it's because of walled gardens, whether it's because a lot of attribution providers have sort of a black box proprietary solution. It's difficult for marketers to know what's going on. Here's another question that the Trade Desk asked last September. They found that about 9 in 10 marketers wanted more objective and transparent measurement systems that weren't a black box. So it can be difficult to trust these solutions. Often marketers see that they assign credit for an interaction to some marketing touch point all the time, even though some conversions are going to be organic, and advertisers understand that. So it's difficult to understand what's going on in a lot of these situations.
So, Nicole, these are all major problems, but there's a major elephant in the room that you haven't even mentioned yet. What's something that's happening this year that's going to make all these issues even harder?
There might even be 2 elephants in the room technically, because the first one is iOS 14.5, which rolled out a little over 2 weeks ago now. I feel like I waited so long. I can't believe it finally really happened, But in iOS 14.5, under Apple's App Tracking Transparency Framework, users have to opt in on a per app basis for cross-app tracking. That includes opting in to share their IDFA, but it does go beyond that, and requires no fingerprinting without that kind of consent as well. This is something that's going to affect basically everything up and down the chain as far as in-app media buying. AppsFlyer and MMA Global surveyed mobile marketers about this last September, and they found that advertisers expected this to have quite negative consequences for everything from audience targeting to cross-device measurement to multi-touch attribution, frequency capping, you name it, whether it's media buying and planning, targeting, or optimization, measurement, attribution. This change does make things more difficult for advertisers, and it prevents them from doing what's sort of just been the standard operating procedure up till now. And the second elephant would be Chrome's upcoming deprecation of third-party cookies, which we expect to happen early next year, at least based on all of their most recent announcements. It's a somewhat different situation from app tracking transparency, but it has very similar effects in terms of making it more difficult, again, just up and down that whole media buying process. Advertiser Perceptions surveyed people about this last July, and they expected it to make buying and planning more difficult, but they really had much worse expectations for the difficulties that this would bring for getting campaign reporting and insights and optimizing campaigns. So again, it's very far-reaching effects from these changes on what advertisers can do to measure and attribute revenues.
Yeah, so these are certainly some pretty far-reaching changes. I don't think we almost need to say that anymore, but how should advertisers think about how to proceed moving forward?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of questions about, is there going to be a cookie replacement? Is there going to be one, ID to rule them all, finally find that perfect universal identifier? But I think, advertisers would do well to ask themselves a more fundamental question here, which is why are measurement and attribution so important to them? What are they actually trying to do? And sometimes, depending on who you ask, if you ask like a channel manager and they're just really thinking about their day-to-day and their team, and they might say, well, we have to measure and attribute so I get more budget next year, so I keep my team next year, so we can make sure that our Facebook ads are doing well. And it's not that those things are unimportant, but they're not actually the fundamental purpose of what we're all doing here. And the point is to gain market share, to sell more goods and services, that type of thing. It's your business goal that needs to be the starting point of successful measurement and attribution. I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. One question that I get pretty frequently is, am I using the right KPIs? Or what's a list of all of the KPIs that we should be using? Can you think of any KPIs that we're not using that might be out there? There are so many key performance indicators in the world, which, we all know, everyone watching knows that. And here's just some charts, different teams, it makes sense for them to use different KPIs because they're doing different things and they have different goals. And if you're a B2B marketer, it makes sense for you to look at qualified pipeline, to look at MQLs. If you're a customer experience professional, Net Promoter Score is going to be really important to you. Customer satisfaction indices are going to be important to you. If you're a product marketer, you're going to want to look at product analytics. But what does that mean as the right KPI for any given team? How do you figure it out? You start at the top. You need to start by identifying your company level objective, because this whole exercise needs to happen from the top down if you actually want all of your teams working together toward the same goal. So identify your company level objective. Maybe that's increasing customer lifetime value. Maybe it's increasing brand affinity and awareness. And then you need to consider what your customer journeys look like. This, of course, is an exercise that many marketers have undertaken in the past, but it's something you have to do over and over again because your customer journeys don't stay the same forever. And especially over the past 15 months or so, so many consumer behaviors have changed. Customer journeys have radically shifted, whether that's more click and collect, more curbside pickup, or just more e-commerce as opposed to brick and mortar shopping. The customer journey has changed. And if you haven't reevaluated this recently, you certainly need to. And frankly, even if it is something that you reevaluated during the pandemic, as the US at least kind of emerges and goes back to a next normal, let's say, you'll again need to reevaluate those customer journeys, make sure you understand what your customers are actually doing. And that's when you can map the right KPIs based on the channel to the customer journey. So, just some examples from this infographic. Take the paid search channel. You might be trying to drive an upper funnel goal there, like brand awareness, in which case impressions is an important metric for you. But if you know that in your customer's journey, paid search is most likely a lower funnel activity, makes more sense to focus on conversions or sales. Similarly for website, if you have a goal of driving more brand awareness, a website visit is a really important high funnel metric. But if you're trying to drive instead conversions and sales, that leads you to your more appropriate KPI on the website as well. The need to align channel level KPIs with business KPIs is still acute. This is still something that organizations struggle with. Organizational alignment is tough. I think we've probably all experienced that in our working lives. And Lauren Fisher, EVP Business Intelligence at Advertiser Perceptions, really also emphasized what an opportunity this time of disruption is to get aligned. If you're serious about moving your measurement toward the actual outcomes that matter for your business, here's a chance to do it, because you know that you're going to need to audit what you're doing to figure out how to plug the holes that appear as a result of cookie deprecation, as a result of app tracking transparency. So as she said, now is the time to really think about how all of those channel-specific KPIs can roll up into larger outcomes, or if they're not currently. You also really need to have a data strategy before you can start making decisions about how you're going to go forward under the new app tracking transparency cookie deprecation regime. And when I say have a data strategy, I do not just mean commit to collecting all of the first-party data that you possibly can. I think you really need to consider, what data do I actually want to use about my customers? And why should they give it to me? What's the value exchange that I'm going to be able to provide them if they do? We've said for a while that you do need to have that value exchange with consumers, that just taking a lot of their data and not giving them any kind of a benefit from it is part of how we got into this situation where there has been a bit of a consumer backlash over privacy and how their information is being used. Having that kind of a data strategy and a really well thought through approach to what do we want to collect, how do we want to process it, what do we feel comfortable with, is the first step in evaluating how you're going to replace your reliance on those endangered identifiers with alternate ones. So if you haven't already done it, it's also definitely time to take an inventory of exactly where you are relying on those identifiers, whether it's third-party cookies, mobile ad IDs, figure out what are those gaps that I'm going to have to fill, and then what fits in with my data strategy as a way to fill it. And I'll just note, it goes beyond just compliance. Obviously, there are regulations in many jurisdictions about this, but in many there aren't, or they're not as stringent as perhaps your company would like to operate. So don't just consider compliance. Obviously, compliance is a critical baseline, but you may want to go further than that in terms of what you're doing. And also, again, consider what's future-proof or not, because I think the industry really agrees that more regulation is coming in the US, whether that's at the state level or at the federal level. So consider what you think is likely to happen, what you're comfortable doing, and whether being future-proof really just means that you have to have the ability to be kind of agile and interoperable and ready to change your tactics as the situation develops.
Great. So are there any other major ways that data strategies are changing beyond just that call to collect and rely on more first-party data as opposed to third-party data?
Yeah, well, the call is so often about first-party, but second-party data and data collaborations generally are also becoming a lot more important. Third-party data isn't like the only alternative option here. There's a bunch of different implementations for data collaborations. You've probably heard a lot about clean rooms at this point. There's not really a strict definition yet about exactly what a clean room is. There's also data bunkers, there's data exchanges, data marketplaces, data co-ops, and all kinds of things that are like this, but maybe not exactly called this. But the point is that there are ways for brands to work together who have different data sets and want to be able to combine those data sets in a way that they can get insights from, but without actually sharing the data, without actually having the data move or leave their control, and also without giving granular access to the data. Because again, concerns here about consumer privacy, data protection, also about data leakage. This is in part, platforms, publishers especially, wanting to keep that data proprietary, not wanting to share everything at a granular level, but still wanting to get something out of that data.
Yeah, so let's back up for a second. There's a lot of jargon here. I've heard first-party data, third-party data, now second-party data. Can you give an example of second-party data?
Yeah, so I'll give an example that I think is a pretty decent illustration of why it often makes a lot of sense to work with second-party data, and also why there's some value add there for consumers. So imagine you're a retailer and you're working with a shipper like, FedEx, just as an example. And obviously, you want to be able to give good customer service to the people who are buying from your website. But FedEx is the one that has all of the tracking information about where their package is and whether it's been delivered or not. It's a huge value add for you to be able to pass that information along to your customer in some way, to have that at your fingertips, to be able to personalize their site experience based on that information. But FedEx, of course, doesn't want to give you granular access to every single line in its databases, but they can give you some kind of a collaborative access with security to let you show that information to the customer, but without actually sharing it back and forth, without having the information move. Another important aspect to moving forward with measurement and attribution, especially as things get more difficult and deterministic identifiers become fewer, is to validate the results and do incrementality testing. I talked earlier about results often being opaque and non-transparent. The first step here is often just thinking through what you actually know about your business, because you know a lot about your business. And sometimes the results that you're seeing from an attribution provider just might not pass the smell test. You might just know this can't be right. It doesn't make sense. And so that's, when you start looking into it further. And the first place to start is to look at the data inputs. Is the data going in correct? Is it accurate? Is it cleansed? Is it skewed in some way? Because maybe that's just messing up the outputs. And then you can kind of get into looking at, is there something wrong with the model if things still don't make sense? And there are organizations that are working on accrediting these models, working to make them more transparent, to help marketers kind of shop around and understand exactly what these providers are doing. The Media Rating Council, for example, has been engaged for about the past year in a project of researching outcome-based ad measurement to really help marketers understand better what's happening with a lot of attribution modeling. And in terms of both validation and incrementality testing, which is so important, experimentation is really key here. The randomized controlled trial is probably the gold standard of experimentation generally, and I definitely encourage advertisers to look into that. But it can be expensive. It's not for everyone. There are some alternatives out there. Ghost ads are one example. There's some other ways that advertisers can kind of A/B test through what they've bought programmatically, sometimes using non-viewable inventory as a bit of a control group that can be interesting as well. But this can both help you validate the model and also help you determine whether you're actually driving incremental revenue as opposed to crediting marketing touchpoints for conversions that would have happened regardless. Definitely be sure to align your organization for success, both in terms of auditing your metrics and figuring out your KPIs, but beyond that as well. Everything I'm talking about is complex. If you're sort of among the most sophisticated advertisers, you're probably using a combination of MTA for a bottom-up view of what's going on with your advertising programs, as well as some form of marketing mix or media mix modeling from the top down to help you with planning. Very complex to understand how all of these insights fit together. And even if you're working with a partner, it does typically make sense to have some type of internal owner, whether that's one role or maybe a center of excellence, to both disseminate those insights throughout the organization and also to be able to explain them to people and how they were arrived at. And the other piece of alignment that I would be remiss if I didn't mention here is around the customer, putting the customer at the center of all of this effort. Because again, many of these changes that are making attribution more difficult right now are down to customer dissatisfaction and their desire for better privacy and data protection. So it's really important to consider whether the approach you're taking to measurement and attribution starts with the consumer. And then finally, just want to repeat a few key takeaways from today. First, it really starts with evaluating your approach to data strategy and ethics. This is foundational. It's going to help you make the rest of the decisions that you need to make. Am I going to work with a probabilistic identifier? Am I only going to work with identifiers for logged in traffic and work with something else contextual for the rest, for example? You can't make decisions like that unless you have a data strategy and a strong approach to what you're comfortable with. Definitely need to audit your metrics, align on the right KPIs. And this is something that you're going to need to do repeatedly as technologies change, as consumer behaviors change. You always want to make sure that you've got up-to-date consumer journeys and that you're looking at the right KPIs by channel and by funnel stage. Once you're there, time to plug holes and test out new approaches to identity. For sure, some of what you do today is going to become impossible with those same methods going forward. Just think of your reliance on third-party cookies, which most brands still do use for some purposes. So figure out where those holes are, what might fill them, and start testing now. Please start testing before next year and cookies are deprecated so that you do have the ability to compare your results of those tests with the traditional identifiers that are still out there. And finally, I really can't emphasize this piece enough. You're going to need to get comfortable with uncertainty. You will have less deterministic data in the future than you have now. So that means more reliance on probabilistic techniques. But even beyond that, marketers have really been sold this idea of digital as a perfectly measurable medium where you're always going to have an exact idea of what's going on at the user level. And even in digital media, no measurement program is a perfect picture of reality. So you really just need to get comfortable with the fact that you're not going to have perfect ideal answers. The map is not the territory here, but that's okay. You're still going to get really valuable insights that will be able to help you get more market share for your products and services. Okay, back to you, Eric.
That was great. Thank you, Nicole. Before we get to your questions live, we're now joined by Kevin Dean, Chief Operating Officer at Infutor Data Solutions. Welcome, Kevin. Thanks again for being here.
Hi, Eric.
Let's start with a question about the cookieless future. As Nicole cited in her presentation, 2/3 of US marketers and agencies expect reporting and insights will be impacted by Google's deprecation of the third-party cookie. In your opinion, what will fill the void of cookies?
Well, at Infutor, we're particularly excited about what the Trade Desk is doing, specifically their Unified ID 2.0. It is one initiative that's emerging among several, but in my opinion and Infutor's opinion, it's the better identity approach for advertisers, publishers, and consumers. And it's built from hashed and encrypted email addresses and will remain open and ubiquitous. Significant upgrades to consumer privacy and transparency, all of these things get us excited. That consumer privacy is paramount in everything that we stand for, and certainly where the industry is going. Overall, I would say it provides better accurate ad targeting with more consumer controls. But that's poised right now to take the place certainly of cookies.
Great. Nicole spoke about some of these in her presentation, but what do you think are the biggest challenges in measurement and attribution before?
Yeah, so not surprising, the onboarding and cookie sync issues have been well known. They've been well documented. They've always been a problem, and the problem rests in you've got a low match rate. Often I hear 40% match to cookies and 40% accuracy, leaving the market or leaving the advertiser with a 16% net effective when they're in their onboarding and cookie utilization. And I think that comes from several different areas where we often forget cookie's not a person, it's a session. And then you're translating sessions to audiences. That inherently is problematic. The results, poor quality audiences being bought and sold in marketplaces with little transparency, all of that kind of rolls into a very ineffective attribution and measurement model that starts with the targeting paradigm all the way into the attribution and measurement. It's just a broken ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. As a company that specializes in identity, what is the most important piece of consumer identity data to a marketer or publisher?
I've said this often, email address is the foundational piece. Practically speaking, when you look at what you can do with an email address, you can almost get an exact match where you can't get that with a name and address. Name and addresses, they fluctuate, spelling varies, and it's hard. It does at times become a little probabilistic with postal, but an email address gets you close to a truth. It is the essential identity enabler across digital marketing platforms. It's the basis for many online apps and transactions. When you think about, the app that you download and you want to use, oftentimes you're asked for, validate your identity or give us a piece of identity information. It is your email address that's most often sought. And when you merge your email address with other pieces of an identity graph, it connects to the other identity markers, such as name, address, and phone. So it is that, one of the ways we've often described it is email is that connective tissue for the advertising industry.
Makes perfect sense. So how can marketers who are collecting data make their first-party data more valuable?
Well, at Infutor, we've emphasized the importance of first-party data for a long time, and surveys show that more investments are being made in first-party data to replace cookies, but the focus should be on data quality. We have to make sure that the data is complete, it's current, it's correct, it's compliant. At Infutor, we observe tens of millions of changes month over month to addresses, email, and phone numbers. You can imagine if you're someone that's operating or using data, you're wanting to make sure that you're keeping on top of that data, keeping it current and accurate at every possible moment. And as Nicole pointed out in her presentation, this first requires a data strategy and a specialized partner to help keep you up.
Great. Now, as companies continue to grapple with some of the attribution and measurement challenges we've discussed today, what are the big concerns the industry needs to address in 2021 and beyond?
Well, it's important to remember we are in this moment because consumers wanted more privacy protections. Marketers need to adhere to these wishes and ensure they are working with privacy compliant data. But you need to make sure you have the right technology to link those data with and protect personally identifiable information. Several tactics for this, things that Nicole talked about: clean rooms, sandboxes, data bunkers, all very good technologies. But then you also have other ways of utilizing data. You've got second-party data that was mentioned, potentially data exchanges. But all of these things together, really what it drives to, it's underscoring the importance of email as that identifier that's bringing all of these pieces of data together into a single point of truth.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. Now, let's get into our Q&A session. We've received a lot of great questions. So I'm going to start off with a question from Don in Milwaukee. Is multi-touch attribution the most advanced approach to attributing revenue to ads?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, what we have seen for a few years is that MTA is a really important component to sophisticated approaches to measurement and attribution. What we think at this point is sort of the most advanced or most sophisticated way is what we usually call holistic attribution, which I sort of mentioned earlier, using MTA as a way to optimize, especially in flight, looking at the bottom up information that way, but also bringing in some type of marketing mix modeling or media mix modeling, MMM, from the top down, which does make planning and budgeting easier in many ways as well. MMM also allows you to bring in factors outside of advertising and outside of your business, essentially, like weather as one example, or like a pandemic, I think would maybe be another good example there.
It's certainly a big example. Now, I have another question from Addison in New York City. We've touched on this, but what IDs can I use if third-party cookies are disappearing?
Well, Kevin mentioned one, which is UID 2.0, which the Trade Desk has been developing along with the open source community and ad tech. But I mean, there's so many, right? There's a whole host of alternative identifiers, including some like UID 2.0, which are based on authenticated audiences, basically means logged in. There's also some that are based on non-authenticated audiences. Obviously, those are different. Instead of being opt-out or instead of being opt-in, they can be opt-out. They might involve things like fingerprinting, and there's all kinds of other specific identifiers like email address, as Kevin said. There's also things like IP address, which some people are comfortable using, some people less comfortable using. So there's so many identifiers. I feel like I could list dozens if I tried. Kevin, anything you would add to that?
Nicole, I think you hit it right on the head. I certainly would start with email. I do love IP address as well. It does bring a little bit of probabilistic nature into it, where you've got further consumer protection in my view, because it's not at the person level. So I think those are probably the two that I would start with.
Fantastic. Now I have a third question from Laura in Annapolis, Maryland. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations for offline to online marketing attribution? Just for example, measuring the success of a PR campaign.
Yeah, well, so that's the kind of thing that, traditionally you might use, for example, MMM for. Also the great kind of thing to try to do some type of incrementality testing with, or some type of A/B testing. But it is difficult to measure that kind of thing. A press release, I think, is a really good example of something where you can't just attach a discount code and say, use this code at checkout so we can attribute this to like our out of home ad. There are definitely some channels like that which will be tougher to measure, but you can use those sort of modeling based techniques like MMM to do that.
Great. So I actually really like this question from Will in DC. What can you tell us about the first 2 weeks of iOS 14.5? How many people are opting in to share the IDFA?
Yeah, well, I can tell you some stuff about that because there has been some research released. You may have seen some data points floating around from Flurry Analytics. I know they've put some data out in the trades. They're showing very low seeming response rates in like the single digits. But what they're putting out is sort of a strange metric. It's a percentage of users. And of course, I mentioned earlier that you have to opt in per app. So that metric does kind of double count users. Like if you have one user who says no a bunch of times, they're, multiple counted there. AppsFlyer has also been putting out some data, and they have a dashboard that I think they're updating it every week at this point. I think it got updated yesterday, and they're showing by category, and they're showing per app averages, and they do vary. They vary geographically. I can tell you they're significantly lower in the US than they are worldwide, and they vary by app category. I can tell you they're lower for social networks, for example, than a lot of other app categories. But in some cases, as high as 40% of users per app on the high end, that is. But just one additional caveat I would say there is that those were, in many cases, early adopters as apps. So might be skewed toward apps that feel like they have a good chance of a user opting in to share their information. I think the thing that I would really mention here is few apps have decided at this point to ask to track. Most apps are not asking to collect the IDFA yet. I've talked to people about this for a while. Most people I talked to expected this to happen. They expected most apps to not ask to collect right away. But people also thought that as consumers got a little more used to seeing the prompt, as it started to maybe seem a little bit less scary, and as app developers realized that they actually really want this tracking information, we'll start to see more apps request. So we should, continue looking for data over the next few months. I know I definitely will be.
Great. So I got another question from Sarah. You mentioned testing incrementality. With the loss of identifiers, this has grown increasingly challenging to gather results that are not contaminated. Can you give your point of view of how incrementality testing is changing as the industry changes?
Well, I guess I would just say that my point of view here is mostly that advertisers are continuing to become more interested in testing for incrementality, which I think is a good thing, even if it is difficult to do. And I do think that a lot of the methods, for example, experimentation, it doesn't necessarily change that much depending on the channel that you're working with, depending on the way that you're running the experiment with these changes that we're seeing now. But yeah, I can definitely understand the concern there. But I think I would just say that running those kind of tests continues to be one of the most important ways for marketers to know whether they're actually improving their position through advertising.
Great. So we have another question from Patrick in Stockholm, Sweden. How are app and web publishers reacting to these changes to keep providing insights to advertisers?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're attempting to work with, for example, lots of alternative identifiers so they can continue to provide impressions that advertisers want to transact on. In many cases, they're also working on alternative strategies like contextual targeting. Lots of larger publishers, especially creating their own segments to help advertisers continue to find the right audiences, but eliminating concerns like data leakage. So yeah, I think they're taking sort of a variety of approaches, including adopting new technologies and also working directly with advertisers to continue to provide them with the right audiences. On the insights side, publishers are also doing, for example, like their own brand lift surveys, for their advertiser partners to prove like, yes, we can still show effectiveness even if we can't provide the granular user level tracking that you might have been used to in the past.
Great.
Anything you would add there, Kevin?
Yeah. No, I think you hit it right on the head. Really good.
Nicole kind of jumped ahead of me. I was going to ask the same thing. So we have another question from Graham in Philadelphia. How do you recommend marketers with physical store presence, for example, national retailers, account for MTA's lack of visibility into lack of visibility into offline revenue specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is where MMM comes into it, right? This is why holistic attribution is important beyond just MTA. And, I mentioned that it's something that we see as sort of the most sophisticated or most advanced. And we don't have an estimate for how many advertisers we think engage in this unified type of analytics, but we do think it's pretty low share. And I would also emphasize that it's more of a journey than a destination to be trying to bring together MTA and MMM to have that fuller understanding. But it is definitely a worthwhile exercise to engage in, even if you're just getting started.
Fantastic. So we have time for one final question, and this is from Eileen in Portland, Maine. How will advertisers shift spending as a result of the end of cookies and IDFAs?
Well, we're all waiting to see on the edge of our seats, right? I think we'll see a whole variety of approaches. What does it seem like we're seeing so far for IDFA? I think it's not super clear. I do think probably some advertisers have optimized more toward Android. I know before the change rolled out, I was speaking to a number of mobile game developers, and they were talking about moving spend into completely different channels, including CTV or various type of in-stream video ads, and also influencer marketing, so something that's not even paid media per se. So I think we'll see lots of alternatives. The other thing I would mention, not necessarily as relevant on the IDFA app developer side, but probably super relevant on the cookie side, is that I'm sure we're going to see more and more spending on retail media or e-commerce channel advertising, which Eric, because you worked on our forecast, is one of the fastest growing channels for digital ad spending. And one of the big reasons is because these are platforms that offer closed loop attribution.
Great. So anything to add on to that, Kevin?
Yeah, I agree completely with the connected TV point. I do see and can see more dollars flowing into that channel. It's got a lot to certainly offer. It is becoming more targeted by the day. Yeah, I think beyond that, if we look back at iOS 13 and what happened with with the lack of physical tracking on a device, and you saw, a lot of opt-outs at the beginning. I think it was less than 20. They'd kind of gravitated up toward 80. I think the market came back along with that. The rise in spend kind of came back and normalized. I think we'll see the same thing here. The early days, we've got a lot of trepidation. Over the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to normalize ourselves out and find it's, all is not lost. We've got a lot of really good identifiers, a lot of really good capabilities in market that we're going to find, take a deep breath, relax, everything's going to be okay.
Totally agree with that.
It's just so interesting to see, spend shift from, various in-app ads to, higher funnel influencer marketing and CTV, and even, back down the funnel to this retail media stuff. And, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again to Nicole for joining us, and a very special thanks to Kevin and to the team at Infutor Data Solutions. Our eMarketer production crew behind the scenes also deserves a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. As promised, we'll be emailing you soon with a link to the slides and the full recording. And finally, before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live Analyst and Tech Talk webinars at eMarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune in to Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast at eMarketer.com/podcast. And finally, please check out our various newsletters. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your workday.